Yeah, I think
It's definitely still swing, so we don't have to do it. But thanks for the...
amazing just how devoted the two of them were. You know.
Good afternoon, everyone. This Level 1 hearing will begin shortly. May I remind you to check your mobile phones and any other electrical equipment you have with you are on silent mode. Members of the public and reporters in the hearing room are not permitted to use any electronic devices during the hearing. If you wish to do this, you could do so in the annex. No food or drink may be consumed in the hearing room except for the water provided. Finally, may I please ask you to remain in situ at the end of each session until the chair and the witness have left the room. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Rickard.
So, Deputy Chief Constable Mills is in the witness box. He is, of course, already sworn.
Yes, you understand that, Mr. Mills, of course. Yes.
Mr. Mills, you have given evidence on two occasions previously to the inquiry, both of them, as I'm sure you recall, while we were sitting in Salisbury. On the first occasion, you helpfully provided some outline evidence about the Wiltshire Police structures and its response to the 2018 poisonings. We will remember you introducing to us those operation names, Operation Fairline and Operation Fortis. Later in that same week, you gave further evidence about the immediate Wiltshire Police response to the Amesbury poisonings, the poisonings of Dawn Sturgess and Charlie Rowley. And today, which is intended to be your last session of evidence, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about the Wiltshire Police response to the Skripal poisonings 4 months or so earlier in March 2018. Do you understand?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So I'm going to start, Mr. Mills, by asking you some questions about the evening of the 4th of March. And many of the questions I ask will, as it were, have a parallel to the questions that Mr. Bailey was asked this morning. We'll cover the same time period, but from a different angle. And I'd like to start then, please, by looking at your witness statement, your third witness statement, which is INQ 006117, page 30.
Page?
Page 30, 30, sir.
Thank you very much. Paragraph?
Picking it up at paragraph 129, please.
Yes, that's helpful, thank you.
And you have recorded there, Mr. Mills, what is now familiar to us, the emergency call, the 999 call from the Maltings made at 16:17 that afternoon. We have, of course, heard not only Mr. Bailey's evidence this morning about the events that followed, but also oral evidence from PC Collins, who was the first officer on the scene, and indeed stayed there, as you know, for some time after the Scripples had been taken to hospital, manning the cordon while the fire brigade attended, and so on. And as we were reminded this morning, we've also heard, we've received in writing written evidence of PC Way and also Sergeant Holloway, who were both there as well, were they not?
That's correct.
I want to ask you, Mr. Mills, about that sequence of events that followed, the events that took place away from the scene, in particular those involving more senior officers in Wiltshire Police. And in particular, I'm going to ask you, first of all, about the actions of Inspector Gillian Hughes. She was she not the force incident manager that night?
That's correct.
We did hear just one or two mentions of her this morning in that role. We know that she was posted in the control room. Am I right that that was not at Bourne Hill Police Station?
No, our control room is in Devizes and covers the whole of the county area that we have a responsibility for.
Yes, thank you. And we will hear that she was in touch with Superintendent Tim Corner. Again, we heard reference to him this morning. Am I right that he was the on-call duty superintendent that night?
That's correct, sir.
And then thirdly, I will ask you about your own involvement that night. In fact, you gave evidence right at the start of our proceedings that you were the on-call chief officer that night.
Yes.
Now, first of all, I think you'll agree that as that afternoon and then the evening progressed, there were developing concerns, were there not, for the safety of the public and also police officers and other emergency responders relating to the safety of whatever substance it had been that had caused the Scripples to collapse.
I would agree.
Just hold that thought a moment, Mr. O'Connor. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the transcript feed doesn't look to be feeding through just at the moment.
No, it doesn't seem to be.
All right, well, if it's being attended to, that's fine, but I'd be grateful because it's a great help in following the following the questions and the answers.
I think I'm being told to suggest we rise briefly. Yes, so I'm sorry to.
Well, I'm sorry if that's my my inconvenience, but it is a great deal easier to follow, and I dare say for others as well.
Yes, well, you spotted it, sir. So yes, perhaps you may rise briefly while we
I will.
rectify.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all fixed.
Yes, sir, I think the
I'm
equivalent...
sorry I interrupted you, Mr O'Connor, and Mr Mills will have forgotten, or if he hasn't, others may have done, exactly what you were prefacing your question with.
Well, I was about to start a series of questions about the developing concern held by police officers regarding public and police safety stemming from concerns around whatever the chemical or drug that may have caused the Scribbles to collapse. And we've heard evidence, including from PC Collins, that the initial understanding or theory was that it might have been fentanyl, a drug which was thought itself to pose a risk to public safety. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so I'd like to pick it up, please, in the witness statement that we have from Inspector Hughes, who, as we've mentioned, was the force incident manager that evening. So if we can go to her statement, please, which is INQ 006132, and if we can go to page 3, at the bottom of page 3, paragraph 20, we see Inspector Hughes saying that she had recently had a generic training input into a new drug called fentanyl, and although she kept an open mind at that stage, it was a consideration of hers because she knew how dangerous it was, and she says she had to keep in mind the safety of the public and the emergency services dealing with the incident. And then if we can go over the page, please, and pick up paragraph 25, we can see that Inspector Hughes says she called the duty inspector, Martin Scorer. Now, just pausing there, so we have an inspector, Inspector Hughes, in the control room in Devizes, the force incident manager, and then a duty inspector, Inspector Scorer. Just in a few sentences, Mr Mills, can you explain their respective functions?
Yes, I can do. And building on my previous response, so in the centre you have the force incident manager who's in the control room, and then the force policing area is split into two areas. There's Swindon, and then there's the rest of the county, and each one of those areas would have a duty inspector who's actually out on the ground, so to speak, and is able to take command of incidents in geographic locations.
Yes, and we've sometimes heard reference to the south of the county. Is that the not Swindon half?
Yes, we call it county or the south of the county. It is geographically south.
And that's what we're concerned with because it includes Salisbury.
Yes.
So she says she spoke to Inspector Scorer, discussed events with him, and that between them they agreed that she would contact the on-call CBRN tactical advisor and someone from the fire service with a view to seeking advice on what to do next because of the chemical aspect of fentanyl, and to identify possible risks to the public and to our officers. So that was the course that they agreed on. And we can see in the paragraph immediately below, she says she obtained details of the on-call CBRN tactical advisor. Again, just help us. Is it right that there was no dedicated Wiltshire CBRN tactical advisor, but rather an on-call system with a regional aspect to it?
At that point in time, we were in a regional collaboration arrangement across three forces, Wiltshire, Avon, Somerset and Gloucester, and again, similar to some of the things we've spoken about before, it had an on-call facility that would fall on one of those officers in the respective forces.
Yes, thank you. So just reading on, we can see that Inspector Hughes records that she was given the name of a police constable from, in fact, Avon and Somerset Police as being the on-call CBRN advisor, but then she adds that despite a message being left on his voicemail around 1849 hours, she never got to speak to this officer, and as far as I'm aware, he never returned the call. It's not clear why. And then looking over the page, she says this was a particular frustration for me, and she refers to some other documents, at least one of which we'll come to later. Well, we'll hear what happened next, Mr Mills, but just on that, there's not much point having an on-call system if the person you ring doesn't ring you back, is there?
I agree.
Do you know whether this incident was looked into or whether it was ever discovered why that individual didn't respond?
I don't know personally, but I'm aware, certainly with the INQ number there, that it was picked up as part of the wider debrief.
All right. But moving on in the story, if we could go, yes, we're on page 5, so if we can scroll down in fact, the very bottom of that page to paragraph 34. This is where Inspector Hughes picks up the story about the CBRN advice that she was seeking. She says, as I had not received a call from the on-call CBRN advisor from Avon and Somerset, she decided to make a call to Police Sergeant Peter Tweet, who was the Wiltshire Police Officer Safety and CBRN trainer, for advice. We can see at the very end of that paragraph that he was off duty at the time she made the call, but it appears that he told Inspector Hughes that there were two Wiltshire Police CBRN advisors, one of whom was on holiday, and the other being VN 005, who we've heard about this morning, and who is going to give evidence next week.
That's correct, sir.
And I think we may well, with him, come to hear what his duties were that day, but he wasn't, obviously, the on-call CBRN advisor that day.
No, he was undertaking other duties.
Yes. And then, if we can go down to paragraph 37, please. Inspector Hughes continues. She says that she determined that he was on duty, as you've just said, engaged on other matters, but she called him on a mobile phone, updated him on what they were dealing with and what she knew, and as far as fentanyl was concerned, VN 005 relayed some suggested precautions, in fact, similar precautions to those that Inspector Hughes had received from others, and he advised against any searches of the home address or vehicle belonging to the Scripples until any further information from the hospital was furnished. And just finishing this part of the story, if we could go over 2 pages to page 8 of the statement, please. We move forward an hour or so, maybe a couple of hours, but if we could then if we could look at paragraph 51 of the statement. In fact, if we could just pull out again briefly, if we look at paragraph 50, we can see that by this stage it is sort of 10 to 9 or thereabouts in Inspector Hughes's narrative. She talks about calling VN 005 again, who stated that he would watch the body-worn video footage taken by officers at the Maltings earlier in the evening when dealing with the Scripples. And having done so, is this your understanding, so in other words, having looked at that footage and seeing the symptoms being displayed by the Scripples, he said it was possibly a CBRN reaction and recommended that Special Branch was contacted for advice, for direction. That's the phrase that Inspector Hughes uses. Is that right?
That is my understanding.
So that is, as it were, takes us through the narrative as far as Inspector Hughes's actions and early concerns about the substance are concerned. And it's right, indeed, we heard evidence this morning that sort of running in parallel, there was also a developing understanding about the identity and background of Sergei Skripal. Is that right?
That's correct.
So, and just to pick this up, first of all, from Inspector Hughes's perspective, if we could go back 1 page in her statement to page 7, please, and we look at paragraph 43. We heard this morning about the police constable who actually, in the course of, I think the way she described it, she was conducting searches on police databases, but then also did a Google or internet search and saw some websites about Sergei Skripal and told Sergeant Holloway and also Nick Bailey about what she had found. That was obviously all going on in Bourne Hill Station, was it not?
Yes, it was.
But it's paragraph 43 that we see Inspector Hughes, from her perspective in the control room in Devizes. She says she received a request at 8 to contact Sergeant Holloway direct via her radio, P2P. We heard about point-to-point this morning. Is that the same thing?
Yes, it is.
And she records that officers had carried out a search of Sergei Skripal online, established that he was a former Russian intelligence officer convicted of spying for the United Kingdom some years before. She says she conducted her own search and came up, She simply says she conducted her own search. And if we look at the paragraph below, we can see that, first of all, in response to that, Inspector Hughes locked down the log, as she puts it, and we heard, in fact, from Mr. Bailey this morning that was a source of some frustration to him. But would that have been part of the force incident manager's role in terms of keeping control over who had access to the log?
Yes, it would. It's a judgment they can make in relation to certain incidents.
Is it a judgment that you're critical of now, that she took that evening?
It's always a balance, no, based upon the information she had. I believe it was a reasonable thing to do.
And then moving down, if we can go to paragraph 45, we can see that 20 minutes or so after receiving the call from Sergeant Holloway, that is Inspector Hughes, updated Superintendent Corner. Now, we can assume, can we, that Superintendent Corner was he at home? I mean,
from recollection from his statement, I believe he says he just arrived on his driveway, having been quite busy with other instances, and received a call.
As the on-duty the on-call superintendent, is this right? There's no requirement to be at Devizes or at a police station?
No, there's not, but on that particular day, he had been in police stations.
So we see, in any event, that Inspector Hughes contacted Superintendent Corner, updated him about this development, and that he requested that the on-call special branch be informed and that Inspector Hughes seeks direction as to what to tell the hospital about this new information. And she shared a photograph taken of Sergei Skripal whilst he was being treated at the Maltings with Mr. Corner, which matched the image on the Wikipedia page. And then, looking at the next paragraph, Superintendent Corner and I discussed the consideration of firearm units being deployed to the hospital. He directed that they be directed to Bourne Hill Police Station to begin with, pending further direction and information from Special Branch. And Inspector Hughes records that at 9:15 that evening she gave a limited briefing to the firearms commander and explained why she wanted them nearer to the scene and hospital. We'll hear a little bit more about the firearms unit in a moment, but before we go any further, and please don't give us information that we shouldn't hear in public, Mr. Mills, but it is apparent that there was some sort of on-call firearms resource available to be summoned.
We have 24/7 firearms assets which are available.
We'll come back to them in a moment then. I want to move, if I may then, to pick up the story with Superintendent Corner's witness statement. So if we could go to that, please. We did look at a different part of the statement this morning, but if we could look at, it's INQ 006163. If we could go to page 6 of the statement, please. And paragraph 26. We see Inspector Corner here Superintendent Corner records his half of the conversation with Inspector Hughes. He says that at approximately 2013 hours, he was made aware that the name of the male on the bench was Sergei Skripal, that he was a Russian national. He'd apparently been identified from documents in his wallet found on his person by officers at the scene. He made a note of the details in his day book. He was subsequently made aware that internet research by other officers had identified him as being a convicted ex-Russian military officer who'd been the subject of a so-called spy swap, who had worked for MI6. And then he says this: I was informed that the individual was not known on any Wiltshire police intelligence systems. He gave instructions for contact to be made with the on-call special branch. That's something that Inspector Hughes has recorded in her own statement. And he explains now the counter-terrorism officer to establish if they held any information that could assist us. And then he says this: I recall thinking about the Litvinenko case, where a Russian national was poisoned by radiation in London, and decided to do my own research regarding the named individual on the internet in my home. He refers to some notes which we'll look at in a moment. He says, I recall finding Mr. Skripal on Wikipedia, which confirmed the information that I'd been passed. I think I also viewed a video at that time which showed the spy swap involving Mr. Skripal. Returning to my thoughts, re Mr. Litvinenko, my considerations at this point was that this may be a similar assassination attempt on the part of the Russian state. And then if we can go on to the next paragraph, please, we can see Mr. Corner says, as a result of my concerns, there were a number of things that I knew I had to do, which included informing the duty senior officer, who at that time was Deputy Chief Constable Paul Mills. Mr. Mills, do you remember Superintendent Corner contacting you that evening?
Yes, I do.
Was this the first time that you had been involved in this case?
Yes, it was.
Can you help us with your memory of what it was that Mr. Corner told you that evening?
Yes, I can. I recall two conversations with Mr. Corner. The first conversation was cut short, and certainly from his statement, I think the relevant times are the first call was 2040, and then a secondary call at 2250. And I recall the information which was said to me from my Day Blue book, having reviewed that, was firstly the background to what had actually occurred in the Maltings was given to me, that two people were unwell and they'd been taken to hospital. He gave me an overview of checks which had been undertaken on Wiltshire police systems, and that had come back with no trace of these individuals. He then updated me in relation to the check that DC Wilby had undertaken, which you've just outlined. He then gave me an overview of the fact that initially the believed reason for them becoming unwell was that the lead for that was fentanyl. However, that had changed to potentially something being ingested, and the source of that was unknown at that point in time.
Did he tell you that he thought this might be an assassination attempt by the Russian state?
No, he didn't.
Did he tell you that he was considering deploying armed officers to the hospital?
Yes, he did.
What was your reaction to him saying that it might be necessary to deploy armed officers to the hospital?
So I think at this point in time we have a number of intelligence gaps. Contextually, I also had a conversation with him about Special Branch and any information that they may have. And if there was a potential threat to these individuals' lives, they were in hospital, and taking out the particular circumstances of that, that is something you would consider doing in such circumstances.
So even if he didn't use the words to you that he thought this might have been an assassination attempt by the Russian state, the context of the internet searches, the discussion of armed officers going to the hospital for protection of the Skripals, you were more or less on the same page that this was something that looked as though it might be extremely unusual going on in Salisbury that evening.
There was certainly that potential amongst a number of other hypotheses.
Let's look, if we may, at those notes that Inspector Corner mentioned. Sorry, I keep calling him Inspector, demoting him retrospectively. Superintendent Corner mentioned in his witness statement. So if we could go, please, to INQ 006164. Just before we get into the detail of it, it's very hard to read, but do you see in the top right-hand corner of this page, there's what looked like a couple of policemen's helmets or hats, and just underneath it, can you see the date? I think it says the 27th of April 2021. The month and the year are easier to read.
That's my reading.
And if we look in the text underneath, we don't need to read it out, but it appears that these notes were taken in the course of a process which took place in April 2021, asking Superintendent Corner about his recollections for the purpose of a health and safety investigation that was going on, I assume, internally to Wiltshire Police.
Yeah, I believe that date is incorrect around the year, sir. Further to PC Bell and Detective Sergeant Bailey becoming unwell, one of the responsibilities of the force was to undertake a health and safety investigation. and involved their health and safety executive. My understanding is, and I've seen the report that follows as a result of this, is that those notes were taken at the time, I would say April 2018, to inform ultimately that investigation.
I see. Well, do we have any explanation as to why, in that case, it says April 2021?
I can only assume it's a typo, sir.
I see. Well, in any event, certainly recollections of Mr. Corner much closer to the time than we are now, and his statement, which he's just provided. Just casting our eyes down the substance of it, then, if we can, stick on page 1 to start with. We see the Sunday, the 4th of March, which is clearly the day we have been concerned with. At 2013, the time we've just been discussing, we see he's put Wikipedia search, ex-Russian officer, convicted of spying, worked as MI6 spy exchange identified. We heard that he made a note of what it was that he'd read on the Wikipedia page. That seems to be that, does it not? And then he says, no warning markers or detail at all found on Wiltshire police system. Again, he's referred to that in his written statement, has he not?
Yes, he has.
So if we go over the page, please, at the very top there, we get to Mr. Corner's record of that first conversation he had with you. TDCC Mills informed, and then this, quote, pending special branch conversation, keep me updated. Now, we've seen a number of suggestions that special branch be contacted. I think one from VN005, another from a discussion between Inspector Hughes and Superintendent Corner, and you are also appear to be suggesting that special branch need to be involved at this stage.
Yes, I certainly felt that was critical at that point in time, because what we had was open source information which was on the internet, and it was vital that we contacted Special Branch to understand what records they had, if any, in relation to the Skripals.
And just before we carry on talking about Special Branch, we will recall the evidence that you gave in Salisbury. I think this was the first instalment of your evidence. You explained that as at, let's say, 2010, there was a standalone Wiltshire Police Special Branch. But that by 2018, that was no longer the case. Is that right?
Yes, there were 4 forces in the collaboration at that point.
And I think the way you put it was that some years before 2018, you had embarked on a journey of sort of regionalising the counter-terrorism function.
That's correct.
And that it morphed into between collaborations of various different police forces. But that certainly in 2018, there was something called the Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit that was a collaboration of a number of different police forces.
That's correct.
And as we can see, perhaps still colloquially referred to as Special Branch.
That's correct.
So looking back at that quote, which seems to have been a quote, something perhaps that Superintendent Corner wrote down at the time, pending Special Branch conversation, keep me updated. Can you help us with what was it that you were expecting Special Branch to do that night?
So if we go with what we reviewed through the open source search, obviously that clearly had raised concerns in relation to what may have happened concerning these individuals. With my requisite experience alongside the other officers, my expectation would have been that there would have been information which was held with Special Branch or the South West CTIU, or indeed higher, which may have assisted us in relation to what I would call triangulating this information, such that we could think about the next actions we should take.
Yes. I mean, the language, we don't need to go back to it, but we'll recall that on the earlier page, that the language that Superintendent Corner used was no warning markers or detail. Now, he's referring to the Wiltshire police systems, but was it that sort of, if you like, warning markers or detail that you thought might be forthcoming from the special branch?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in relation to the special branch systems, but in policing generally, you have intelligence systems and information systems. So we've spoken already around the PNC and the niche system. They would be what I would call local Wiltshire systems. Above that in special branch, they had something which believe was called the National Special Branch Intelligence System. And my expectation would have been that potentially information would be held on that.
Right, so if we can take the story on to see what did happen that night, and for those purposes, first of all, we'll go back to Inspector Hughes's witness statement, please. So that's INQ 006132. If we could go to page 8, looking first of all at paragraph 52 of her statement. And she's referring to her records or to the log. She says, I note that I called Special Branch at 20:57, 33 hours, and spoke to a Detective Chief Inspector from Gloucestershire Police, just pausing there, that is an illustration of the regional capacity.
It is, sir, yes.
She says, whose details I can't remember. We discussed all the symptoms, the advice from VN 005, and the information gained from the internet. I again asked for direction, but in my opinion, he didn't seem to be particularly interested. He told me that no ex-Russian spy was living in our area. And if we can just go down to the bottom of the page, please, paragraph 55. She picks up the story. At 23:04, 10 hours, I note that Superintendent Corner called me. I updated the log as we spoke. He told me that he had spoken to CBRN Centre. He was awaiting a call back. In the interim, the Skripal's car was to be recovered. All scenes were to be locked down. I noted that Detective Inspector Ben Mant was now the SIO. He decided that the vehicle was going to remain where it was, pending forensic advice, and so on. And then if just finally go to paragraph 56, please, where Inspector Hughes adds that during that call, in other words, a call at 11 o'clock that night, she says, I recall discussing our frustrations around my perceived lack of interest or direction from Special Branch, in particular regarding informing staff at Salisbury District Hospital about what we had researched about Sergei Skripal. So that is what she has put in her witness statement. As I think you know, Mr. Mills, there is a slightly pithier account from Inspector Hughes, which appears in an email that she wrote. So if we could go, please, to IMQ 006149. Thank you. If we scroll down a little way, we can see the bottom half of this page, an email sent from Inspector Hughes to David Minty. Who is David Minty?
So David Minty is the superintendent who undertook the role as the Tactical Coordination Group Chair within the LRF response, Local Resilience Forum response.
Thank you. And as we'll see, we'll look at the text in a moment, but what we have here is Inspector Hughes's recollections of this night. And the date is 14th of April 2021. I had wondered whether that was linked to the April 2021 date on Mr. Corner's document, his health and safety document. But if you tell me that that is a mistake, then that's obviously less likely, unless this email date is also a mistake, which seems unlikely.
No, I think that's date and time stamped on the email.
Can you help us with, I mean, it may not matter very much, but why you think that they might have been exchanging this email 3 years or so after the event?
I'm afraid I can't, so it's the first time I've seen the email.
All right. If we can look then at the content of the email, we can see that Inspector Hughes is saying at the very beginning that she still can't access the log. So I think we can take it, do you agree, that the recollection which follows is, unlike her witness statement, not based on the log, but just on the basis, presumably, of, as she says in the next sentence, what she can recall. The paragraph numbered 1 she provides her memory of the incident we've already seen in her witness statement of her trying to contact the on-call CBRN advisor but being unable to reach him. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
And then two, and it may be that we can infer that she had been asked, we haven't seen an email that sort of prompted this email from her, but it may be that she was asked to provide any sort of her memory of anything that didn't go well that night, for example. But in any event, we can see the paragraph that starts 2 reads, "The second and longer issue was contacting the on-call special branch. If I remember rightly, he was a Gloucester officer. With the information shared, he did not appear to show any interest in what we were concerned about, and from memory was very dismissive and acting totally that we were overreacting, despite concerns from our CBRN TAC ad, who had observed the body-worn video and agreed the symptoms were consistent with CBRN reaction, and that the person on the body-worn video appeared to be the same person as identified on internet. Despite trying to confirm that actions were being completed by Special Branch, he came back and said that Special Branch were not aware that Scripples was housed in Salisbury and that they were not taking any further action. This resulted in me getting Superintendent Corner to call him direct to discuss. All the delays in confirming who it was, concerns it could be CBRN, meant that the hospital was not advised of our concerns and then subsequently potentially impacting the medical treatment. We'd been due to complete our shift at 2:30 when night force incident manager took over. However, we remained until about 0300 trying to get some action taken and a number of repeat calls to the special branch on call. However, then finally agreed with Superintendent Corner that we would all go home and he would raise it at 0700 hours. What would have been good to know, or at least advise, was that it was being treated as serious, whereas we were left believing that Special Branch and London were just thinking we were overreacting and completely making things up that were not there. Now, Inspector Hughes clearly seems to have felt that Wiltshire Police that night, and I think you told us that Wiltshire Police is the third smallest force in the country.
That's correct.
Was not being given appropriate support by counter-terrorism police. Was that a view that you shared that night?
Certainly the detail, as is detailed there at 2, was not shared with me. I was aware and indeed pressed myself on at least one occasion that Special Branch and the information, or the South West CTIU, should I say, were central to understanding further information. I was updated that further to at least 2 calls, and I think there was 4 in total, there wasn't any information in relation to the Scripples that could take us any further. That was my understanding.
But we've seen both in Inspector Hughes' statement and also obviously in this email a degree of frustration, a substantial degree of frustration about the way in which Special Branch were seemed like failing to engage with the calls they were making to them. Is that something that you remember being relayed to you that night by Superintendent Corner?
No, I don't recall that. In the 2 interactions I had with Superintendent Corner, we spoke about Special Branch information. He updated me about at least 2 calls, and each time there was no further information which was available, which was relevant, that could assist us.
Certainly, it's quite clear that, as you've said, Special Branch were being asked for information. I just want to ask you whether it went further than that. For example, if we look, we're still looking at this email, about 5 or 6 lines down, that numbered paragraph 2, do you see the sentence which reads, or starts, despite trying to confirm that actions were being completed by Special Branch, he came back. You see that? It's in the middle of the line, the word despite, under CBRN, despite trying to confirm that actions were being completed by Special Branch.
Yes, I can see that.
I mean, it's not your email, of course, but the word actions, plural, it appears as though Special Branch were being asked to do more than just search their records. Are you aware of any wider tasks that they were being asked to undertake that night?
Taking myself back to that point in time, no, all I was aware of was the Inspector Hughes had spoken to them and Superintendent Corner had spoken to them, and there were still active inquiries ongoing, and we awaited the response from Special Branch at that point, or the South West CTIU.
Let me ask you a related question, but by reference to Superintendent Corner's notes. So if we could go back to INQ 006163, please. And if we could go, first of all, to page 2. Sorry, I'm so sorry, I've given the wrong reference.
That's his witness statement.
Yeah, it's 6164. I'm sorry. So if we could go to the second page, please. And do you see, first of all, Mr. Mills, at 2200 hours, there is a call from, and then a very, very small cipher, but I think we know that that individual was either the head of that unit or certainly the person that Mr. Corner was speaking to that evening.
He was the on-call officer, as I understand.
The on-call officer, thank you. So a call from that individual who said they are the checking systems at the airport, and just to make sense of that, maybe if we look at the very top of this page, at 2100, and perhaps we should have started there, an earlier conversation where Mr. Corner speaks to the on-call special branch, and there's that cipher again. The focus of the discussions was fentanyl, Wikipedia findings. The on-call special branch man advised that they had a staff member at the airport who could complete some checks to see if they know anything. So that's the reference to the airport.
Yes.
Do you know what those sorts of checks might have been?
No, I don't. I'm aware that we have or would have special branch at all airports.
Yeah.
Exactly what those checks would have been, I'm not able to assist with that.
All right. But if we go back down to the 10 o'clock entry, that explains the reference to checking systems at the airport. But it was the next sentence I wanted to ask you about, because the special branch officer confirmed that special branch will not be assigning a special branch senior investigating officer, and advised Mr. Corner to run as a normal incident through local force DL. DL means?
Detective Inspector.
Oh, DI, Detective Inspector. And then just hold that in your mind. If we go over the page, that having been 10 o'clock, if we go over the page to 2300 hours, another call between Mr. Corner and Special Branch. And we can see, again, response was that no further intelligence or information can be given, plus a repeat of the message that no special branch SIO will be assigned. So we are certainly getting the sense, are we not, of repeated phone calls and a degree of frustration?
Yes, and certainly in my 2 interactions with Superintendent Corner, we spoke about special branch and the importance of asking them again, was there anything that could assist us?
But what about this reference to special branch assigning an SIO? Is that something that you were aware was in the mix that night?
I do not recollect that.
You don't recollect it. Judging by your experience, and we will bear in mind that certainly Mr. Corner regarded this as a potential state assassination. He had engaged firearms police. Is it something, looking at it now, that you think was worthy of special branch taking over the lead on that night?
I guess from my perspective, we're acting in good faith here. The model is such that we would link in with the on-call Special Branch South West CTIU officer and inquire whether or not there was any information intelligence. If they'd have come back that there was information intelligence, I think the next natural conversation would be, is it something they're interested in, and would they be looking to appoint a senior investigating officer?
You'll have to help us with that, Mr. Mills. Why does the question of whether counter-terrorism police take over this incident depend on whether they had intelligence or not?
Because at that point in time, we only had open source information. It was a hypothesis that potentially, as Mr. Corner has spoken about, although that was not relayed to me around the assassination element of it. There was concerns at that point, and again, we're trying to build information here such that if they'd immediately come back and stated to us what we now know, absolutely my expectation at that point in time would have been that the South West CTIU would have linked into the wider counter-terrorism policing infrastructure, and they would have taken the investigation at that point. But we didn't have that.
No.
No.
And just for completeness, before we move on then, I think you're saying that from your memory, you don't even remember this issue of them supplying an SIO that night and taking over the operation. You don't remember that being discussed with you?
No, I've reviewed my blue book, which is, sorry, forgive me, is my day book where I make notes, and I don't have reference to that, but what I do have is around an investigative officer being appointed. It was clear that it needed a senior investigating officer, and that ultimately became DI Mant.
Yes, so you are talking about appointing an SIO from within your own force?
Yes, because we were not in possession of anything, which would be, I guess, a tipping point would be if we had information which was in that wider South West CTIU.
All right. Let me move on, if I may, Mr. Mills. We've obviously seen evidence. We heard it this morning. We've just been looking at evidence from Inspector Hughes and Superintendent Corner about the lack of information that was available on your own. I'm now talking about your Wiltshire systems.
Yes.
And may we go to your own statement, please, INQ 006117, and go to page 30. And if we can just look at two paragraphs. First of all, paragraph 128, at the top of that page, you say, prior to the 4th of March 2018, Wiltshire Police held no relevant information on the Skripals or any threat to them. And for completeness, if we can go to paragraph 136, which is on the next page, page 31. I think you say the same thing in a slightly expanded way. You see there was no relevant information on Wiltshire Police's systems concerning Sergei Skripal, and no trace of him on Wiltshire Police's intelligence systems. Now, just focusing on that for a moment, in the first part of that paragraph, you use the word relevant, and that's an important word, isn't it? And because presumably, if one interrogated Wiltshire Police's systems generally, then there would be some information about Mr. Skripal. In fact, we've already seen in the log you were able to access information about his car ownership, insurance, and so on.
So that was from the police national computer?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you say there was no relevant information, is that a way of saying, leaving aside the sort of everyday information about his car ownership and his address and his car insurance?
I think what he's saying, Mr. O'Connor, is it's a difference between Wiltshire systems and the national PNC.
That's correct, sir.
Or indeed driving licence, presumably.
Yeah, if it helps the inquiry, just very briefly. So what did we have available to us at that point in time? There's in essence three systems. There's the police national computer, which is a national system, but by definition, we've heard about the niche system. That is in essence our local intelligence system. And the question was asked this morning to Sergeant Bailey around P&D, which is the Police National Database. And what that does is it filled a void in policing, whereby in the past you would have had 43 separate intelligence systems. It actually joined up intelligence, which was placed onto the Police National Database, which wasn't convictions but relevant intelligence, but at the level below Special Branch.
So if we take them in turn, the Police National Computer, clues in the name, it's a national system not specific to Wiltshire.
That's correct, sir.
Is that the system that would have contained some information of the mundane type that we've just been discussing about driving licences and so on?
Yes, it would do. I mean, in essence, to assist if somebody's been arrested or has a conviction, they would appear on that. Again, it would have vehicle details that are registered to individuals, and latterly it has things such as insurance details, etc.
All that's on PNC, is it?
All on PNC. So if someone was missing, it also has markers as well. So if somebody had come to police attention, you can put a marker on there.
So on that system, information about Mr. Scripple, but nothing relevant.
That's right.
Next, the Police National Database, which you've described as an intelligence database, so not convictions, but intelligence reports and so on. Also a national system.
Yes, that's correct. And no information on that.
So does that fit into the second part of paragraph 136? We don't have to say there's no relevant information on the PND. There's simply no information at all.
That's correct. I think the only reason that I've used relevant in there is my understanding latterly, I didn't know this at the time, was information had come back from Special Branch around, I believe there'd been a check on Mr. Scripple's son at the airport. But again, in terms of relevance to this, there was nothing which would take us any further.
Well, we heard from Mr. Murphy about the information about the check on Mr. Scripple's son.
Yes.
But that wasn't from Wiltshire Police Systems, was it?
No, it wasn't. No.
Well, let's just stick with the systems that you were able to interrogate yourself. So we've dealt with the PNC, we've dealt with the PND. The third you mentioned was the niche system.
Yes.
Was that some information about him but nothing relevant, or nothing?
There was no information on that system.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to go on and ask you just a few questions about the search of 47 Christa Miller Road that evening, Mr. Mills. We've obviously heard plenty of evidence about what happened already today, and we also saw some of what Superintendent Corner had to say about it in his own statement. Is it right that he discussed the search with you before it took place?
So my recollection and my notes indicate that he certainly indicated that there was the potential to undertake a search. And if we put this in a timeline, I believe this was the second call at 22:50.
Yes. Well, let me, if I may, let's have a look back at Superintendent Corner's statement, see what he says about it, and then you can tell us whether your memory or your records differ. Thank you. So if we're going to go back to his statement, which is INQ 6163, and we can see there paragraph 38. And Superintendent Corner says it transpired that one of the armed officers, we've heard about them, deployed to Salisbury was also a trained CBRN tactical advisor. At some point I had a telephone conversation with him where I explained the information available to me. From viewing the notes, the notes we've already looked at, the officer described the symptoms presented by the casualties to me. These symptoms were discharge of mucus, defecation, vomiting. He had at some point also viewed body camera footage of the two casualties. It's VN 005 we're talking about here, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And Mr. Corner says, consequently, he advised me that their symptoms could be due to poisoning by way of radiation or by a nerve agent, but most likely the former, i.e. radiation.
Yes.
Next paragraph, Mr. Corner records that at 22:35 hours or thereabouts that evening, he spoke to a female duty officer at the National CBRN Centre. He provided her with an overview of the incident and his online research. He further advised that the indications were that the cause of the casualty's illness was not fentanyl poisoning, but based on his conversation with the CBRN tactical advisor, possibly radiation or nerve agent based. And that person at the CBRN Centre said she would speak to scientists who would then call him back. And then paragraph 40, he says, from this point on, I received a large number of calls from the scientific community involving a number of different scientists. And he explained the situation and information to date each time he was called by a different scientist. And the same message was reiterated. This message was that the symptoms did not sound like radiation poisoning, And Mr. Corner adds, from his recollection, there was also no further mention of a chemical agent as being a likely cause at that time. And then scrolling down, we get to a series of paragraphs that, in fact, we looked at this morning, but just to remind ourselves, Mr. Corner continues to explain his thinking behind the need to search the house. Paragraph 41, he explains he was concerned there might have been someone else located inside it who needed medical attention. And just casting our eyes down, we can see paragraph 42, he says at that stage, whilst I still did not know the cause of the Skripal's incapacitation, I was considerably relieved that they'd ruled out radiation poisoning and not suggested the likelihood of a nerve agent. That's his description of his mindset at the time. He goes on to say that the indications from the CBRN tactical advisor and that community was that a cursory search could safely be conducted as long as suitable protective equipment was used. And then a few lines further down, he says, I therefore concluded that on balance, CID officers, supported by the CBRN tactical advisor, was the most effective solution in the circumstances that we faced. And he then describes it as a decision that he had had cause to regret and explains what he means by that. The specifics of the search, the briefing, is described. And then if we could go on to paragraph 44, please. He says, at 22:50 hours, I further updated DCC Mills. Now, you mentioned when we started this part of your evidence, Mr. Mills, that you remembered there being two calls.
Yes, I do.
Would this be the second one?
Yes.
Mr. Corner says, I related the views of the various scientists who were ruling out radiation as a probable cause, along with the fact that the symptoms presented by the casualties were also not indicative of radiation poisoning. I added that there had been no further suggestion of the cause being a chemical nerve agent. I further advised him of the position of Special Branch in that they were not going to appoint an SIO. And just pausing there, you've told us today that you don't remember there being any discussion about SIO, but Mr.
I recall the conversation in relation to DI Mant. I don't recall the element in relation to Special Branch not appointed.
Which is just reading on, and had advised us to allocate investigations to local officers. I apprised him that DI Mant had been called out to supervise ongoing investigations and of our intention to conduct a cursory search of the home address, that all scenes were being secured for further investigations in the morning. I do not remember receiving any additional instructions from him. That's his recollection or his account of the conversation that he had with you that night. To what extent does your recollection differ?
So my notes, which are at 006112, basically I put in my notes PM, and what that means is from that point onwards in my notes, what I wrote down at the time in terms of what's relevant. So I put identification as number one, scenes, expert advice, media, investigation, health and safety, media, lockdown and support. And then I expand on those in my first statement in terms of giving context to what I meant by that. So that would be routine when I've spoken to somebody in an on-call capacity and I was required to give some direction. The reason I put PM is what follows after that is my recollection of what I said to him at the time. So in essence, I'm setting my strategy at that point in time in relation to guide his tactical decision making.
And PM stands for?
Paul Mills.
Oh, it's your own?
Yes.
Do you, tell us if you don't, if your memory just doesn't stretch to this, Mr. Mills, but do you remember reaching a view at the time about whether this search was an appropriate search?
I remember us discussing the search, and I remember the rationale for it being, one, to check for individuals that were potentially inside, and secondly, for any information that may assist around this picture of building information. At that point, I don't recall we agreed that it would take place, and I don't think it was my place to do that. Again, I'm setting a strategy here, and things such as health and safety, taking expert advice, the conversations I was having with him. This is quite a dynamic situation where, as we can see, he's still taking further advice and information nationally and talking to scientists, is that should inform those actions, and particularly things such as if we are going to go into there, there's potentially an unknown risk, so things such as personal protective equipment, those sorts of things. That is my recollection.
Yes, I mean, clearly the need to, or the desire to check for other casualties is an obvious and important factor.
We have a duty to do that.
But it must be quite unusual to receive a call from someone saying, well, we're a bit worried about radiation, and I've called the CBRN Centre and I've spoken to about 5 different scientists. I mean, that's unusual, is it not?
Yeah, first time in my career.
But you describe it as a balance, which clearly it was. I was going to come to that other matter you raised, which is whether it was for you to strike that balance, or for Superintendent Corner, or indeed for DI Mant. We've seen different suggestions about who actually decided to conduct the search that night. Certainly DI Mant was involved, certainly Superintendent Corner was involved, and we've seen his statement that he spoke to you about it. From your perspective, who was making the decision that night?
That was ultimately for Superintendent Corner. The reason that I've set out PM and those elements which I've spoken about below that is that I'm giving him some parameters in which to operate, that we have to consider things such as expert advice, health and safety, those considerations, and relative to the dynamic element that I've discussed, he's taking appropriate advice at that point in time, as I expected that he would do. The people that can help here are the National CBRN Centre and the assets they have access to, and he's appropriately doing that.
You presumably could have forbidden him to undertake the search if you had felt it appropriate.
Yes, I could have, yeah, I could have put what's called a tactical parameter on there that nobody will go in, but I trusted his judgment because I was assured that he was taking appropriate advice from people who could advise him.
Just finally on this part of it, if we could go to your statement, please. This is your third statement, INQ 006117. And the top of that page is paragraph 154. Now, in this statement, at least, you don't mention the conversation with Superintendent Corner, Mr. Mills, but you do say here at paragraph 154 that a decision was made by DI Mant that a search of 47 Christa Miller Road was necessary. Help us. You've said a moment ago that it was DS or Superintendent Corner's decision. How do we reconcile those two things?
From my reading of Mr. Corner's statement, is that they're having a conversation between the two of them. They're exchanging sort of professional views on, firstly, the requirement to undertake a search, and then secondly, how that search should actually be conducted. I guess if you go back to before, I've spoken about gold, silver, bronze. I've given some strategic parameters. The silver commander, which is Superintendent Corner, his job then is to develop a tactical plan. And then you've got DI Mant, who's at the operational level, in purist terms. It's for him then to put that operational plan in place. That's the purism of it. I think what we see is an exchange between them, which is sensibly and professionally considering the available information to come to that decision to ultimately undertake the search.
Yes. Well, so we've seen a record of your conversation with Superintendent Corner at, I think it was 10 to 11 that night.
Yes.
22:50. That was the second of the calls you mentioned. And is it right then that that was the end of your involvement that night?
Yes, critically, what I did say at the end of that is if there's anything further which is discernible and important, then do give me another call. But I didn't receive any more calls.
You were still the on-call chief officer?
I was all the way through to the next morning, 7 o'clock the next morning.
Yes. And let's come to the next morning then, and we can come to, if we go to the next page of your statement, just to cover off the chronology really, Mr. Mills. We've spoken about the fact that the night before, the night of the 4th, there was no decision for Special Branch or CTP to take over the investigation. That decision came the next morning, did it not?
Yes, it did. So as I sort of got up in the morning, was on my way to work, I started to make and receive calls. And one of the calls that I had was from the detective superintendent, who at that point in time was in charge of the South West Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit. And that was the point in that conversation where I was given further information and advised that they would be taking the investigation over.
And we can see, in fact, we're looking at paragraph 161 of your statement where that's indeed what you record there, isn't it?
Yes.
And we heard evidence from Mr. Murphy about the process involved in CTP taking over what was to become Operation Wadana.
Yeah, there's a short period to mobilise between Wiltshire Police holding the investigation, the Southwest, Sec 2, South East Counter-Terrorism Unit taking over the investigation, and that happened during the course of the next sort of 24 hours or so.
Yes, and once that had fully followed itself through, Wiltshire Police became concerned with that phrase we used, consequence management.
That's correct, sir.
There's one further set of questions I may ask you before I suggest we have a break, and that is connected with that consequence management role. And I wonder, for these purposes, if we could have, please, INQ 006025. This is an email exchange, which I think we'll look at it and then I'll ask you, but I think we will see that this is in fact an email exchange between counter-terrorism policing officers, so not including Wiltshire Police, but it is about Wiltshire Police. And as ever with an email exchange, let's read it from the end back. So if we could go to page 3, please. We can see just below the top of the page, the first email in the chain is dated the 13th of March, so a few days or 9 days after the poisoning, yes?
That's correct, sir.
A particular CTP officer has emailed a different CTP officer. There are some details redacted, but then up beneath that, the language is this: a lack of satisfactory cordon control has been a constant issue throughout this investigation, noting that it's only been going on for a week or so, in particular relating to Christie Miller Road, as the scene guard was absent yet again this evening from the front door of the house, where when one of our FMT staff checked. FMT standing for?
It's a counter-terrorism term, forensic management team.
Right. Reading on, I'm aware of 2 other occasions when we've had to ask for the cordon officer to return to this post. The insecurity means that members of the public living or visiting the street could have just walked into this dangerous crime scene unchallenged. This issue has previously been addressed with Wiltshire, so much so that we prepared our own briefing sheets with printed strict instructions to stop this from happening, but it did. The seriousness of unauthorised access into either site cannot be overstated. Then, at the very top of the page, we see the next email, which is sent early the next morning, just one line. Can you raise this with Kath and someone else this morning, please? I tried to resolve late last night. I'm going to Salisbury this morning to meet the superintendent. And then there's a name which may be misspelt.
It's Chammings.
Chammings. Was that a Wiltshire police officer?
Yes, it is, yes.
To raise our concerns face to face. And then on to page 2, please. The next email halfway down that page. Now we see this is sent from a Seifert officer to Catherine Barnes, who was Catherine Barnes?
So she was the Detective Chief Superintendent who was in the South East Counter-Terrorism Unit.
Yes. Looking at this email, Kath, just so you're aware, Wiltshire Police have then had to remove guards from a couple of locations, including, disturbingly, the Christie Miller Road scene. A particular officer is going to see the consequence manager for Wiltshire in person to try to resolve this issue in person and asked me to raise this with yourself. You're clearly very busy, hence email rather than in person. And then her response, if we scroll up, please. Are you telling me the Christie Miller Road scene was not secured overnight? And then onto the next page, page 1 of the document, the response that she gets. No, but it would have been if the forensic management team had not checked the scene last night before finishing and insisted on it being secured via a guarding officer. A lack of satisfactory cordon control has been a constant issue throughout this investigation. I'm aware of 2 other occasions when we've had to ask for the cordon officer to return to this post. And then lastly...
Forgive me, Mr. O'Connor. Could you just ask, please, for the to scroll down? I want to see the message before this one.
That was the
query from
Barnes.
Superintendent Barnes.
Yes.
I just want to see the terms of it. I see.
So she's saying, "Are you telling me it was not secured?"
And the answer was no.
As I read it, he's saying, "No, I'm not telling you it was unsecured."
But it might have been.
It would have been if we hadn't told them
Got
to
it.
go back to their post or similar. And then the last email at the very top of the first page, someone is being addressed. Can I bring this to your attention and ask that you address this in gold or SCG? Now, first of all, Mr. Mills, have you seen that email before? Or at least was it a document that you saw back in 2008?
No.
Was it an issue that you were involved with, to your memory, back in 2018?
No, it wasn't. Where it says gold, my understanding is that would have been the Assistant Chief Constable who was leading the Wiltshire Police specific response,
Yes.
where that would have been dealt with.
We have heard your evidence that you were the chair of the SCG.
Yes.
And that was one of the possible routes of escalation referred to. But we can take it then that either it wasn't escalated to the SCG, or if it was, no doubt, there were an awful lot of things you were dealing with. You don't remember it now.
It certainly, in my 240-page statement, it doesn't appear. I don't recall that ever being escalated to the SCG level. I would imagine that it was dealt with through a conversation with the Gold Commander. Just contextually, sir, at this point in time, 11 scenes, we're having what's called mutual aid from lots of different police forces. I would imagine some of the challenges here are the number of scenes and also specifically briefing of officers in terms of their responsibilities. I know latterly that Wiltshire Police put in place arrangements around specific briefing officers for officers that were coming from different forces. But some of that is my assessment post fact.
I understand that as it were an assessment of what might have happened. Do you actually remember the issue being raised with you?
It wasn't, sir.
It wasn't with you. All right.
Since, if in that case, I won't pursue it at any length, Mr. Mills, but may I just ask you this? I mean, of course one understands that it was a very busy time, that you were having mutual aid from other forces, but all the evidence that this inquiry has heard, including the evidence we heard this morning, underlines what an extraordinarily dangerous place 47 Christie Miller Road was at this point, doesn't it?
It does.
And so it does seem pretty extraordinary that potentially it was being left unattended at night.
If that was the case, I would be significantly concerned in relation to that.
That is what's being said here, isn't it?
Yes. Again, I'm reading an email, but if that's what's said and that's what's happened, yes, very concerning.
You're reading an email about Wiltshire police officers not manning the cordon, and you still are, the Deputy Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police, are you not?
I am indeed.
So it does seem that this was a very important and pressing matter that was being raised, doesn't it?
I would agree.
Yes, thank you. So I have a few more questions. I think even after the enforced break we've been going for about an hour and a quarter. So may I suggest we have a break at this point?
Certainly, 3 o'clock, please.
All rise.
Mr. Mills, we touched just before the break on your role in the SCG, the Strategic Coordination Group, following the Skripal poisoning. It's something you gave a fair bit of evidence about during your sessions in Salisbury. And you were the chairman, as we mentioned earlier. And in summary, is this right, that that group, the SCG, brought together representatives of many different government agencies that were involved at the time in consequence management?
That's correct, sir.
Those organisations, those agencies included PHE?
That's correct.
And that public health was one of the many matters that was considered by the SCG?
Yes.
You were also asked, I think by Ms Whitelaw, when you gave evidence in Salisbury, about public health advice on the theme of don't pick it up unless you dropped it. And you, your evidence then was that you were not aware of any such advice being given prior to the Amesbury incident. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
If I could ask you to look at your witness statement, again, your third witness statement. So it's INQ 006117, page 41, please. Paragraph 181. You're referring there to the 5th of March, so the Monday.
Yes.
Already it's the third SCG that's being held. And you refer there to an update from the STAC. Was that the sort of scientific advice committee that one of those committees you referred to, again, while giving evidence in Salisbury?
It is, yes.
You had an update from them that they had concluded that there were no known wider health risks to the public, and this position had been agreed nationally by PHE. It was clarified this position had been reached with appropriate scientific rigour, and PHE updated that any wider public health messaging would be undertaken by PHE national team.
Yes.
Can you just expand on that a little bit? What I think what one understands from that is that from that point on, some of what might otherwise have been the function of the SCG was taken over by PHE. Is that fair?
It is, perhaps just briefly to assist you, sir. So I think I gave the example last time of a local big fire. In those circumstances, it would be a localised response. So I would be the SCG chair. I would put in place the Science Technological Advisory Cell, which would be led locally, and they would provide me with advice at a local level around it, say things like plume coming from the fire and whether or not there's a risk to the wider public as a result of that. With this, it needed a national response to work alongside the local response, and on that first day of the major incident, it was confirmed to me that it had been declared as a national public health response, and from that point forward, as you allude, the assessment of risk and critically the communications that followed as a result to the public would be given to the SCG through the national structures that have been put in place.
I see. So, but it would still be, if the SCG wasn't, as it were, divorced from the process. It's just that there was that degree of national leadership.
Yes, and I think in essence you've got sort of a couple of elements going on. There's the national guidance, and then, as I alluded to when I previously gave evidence, there's consideration. Again, I'll give it some context. For example, earlier on in the inquiry, sir, you saw the young children being given the bread by Mr. Skripal. Those sorts of things would be considered locally, and if they needed to take some advice, they would link in nationally for that advice. But the communication bit is critical with this, so we didn't end up with disjointed communication. That would be decided nationally, and then at the operational level locally, we would look to put that advice out. So just coming to a conclusion, an example would be when we did have the if you didn't drop it, don't pick it up advice, we had police community support officers going into schools, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So even though...
Where did it come from, that?
So that would have come nationally, sir.
You implemented
yes,
it by sending policemen round schools and so on?
Yes, putting posters up, etc., those sorts of things.
I see.
just to be clear, I think this is what you're saying, Mr. Mills, but is this right, that notwithstanding the national leadership and responsibility that PHE were taking for public messaging, the implementation of it, at least in Salisbury, would still be something that the SCG would be involved in?
That's right, yes.
With that in mind, I'd like to ask you just to look at one document which we didn't show you when we were discussing these matters in Salisbury, and that is, please, INQ 004745. If we could go to the first page initially, please. Thank you. What we see here, Mr. Mills, is notes, or minutes, or maybe draft minutes of a meeting held by Public Health England. Yes?
That's correct, sir.
We see the title of the meeting, Wiltshire Incident SRG meeting. The date is the 9th of March, so it's the Friday at the end of that week. You just referring to a SCG meeting on the Monday. This is a few days later,
yes,
on the Friday at the end of that week. And then if we just cast our eyes briefly at the attendees of the meeting, we can see that it is, I think, almost without exception, people from PHE.
That's correct.
It doesn't include your name.
No.
Are you familiar with what this meeting, or this series of meetings, or the SRG was?
I'm not.
I think it's probably therefore obvious, but let me ask it: were you aware of this document either at the time or subsequently?
No, I was not.
Have you had a chance to have a look at it before you giving evidence?
I haven't, sir.
All right. Well, let me just show you, please, page 4 of the document. It's one part of the discussion at the meeting that I wanted to ask you about, bearing in mind it's the 9th of March. This therefore appears to be some form of internal PHE discussion, and we can ask others, because you've made it clear you can't help us with exactly what the forum was, what the meeting was. But we see that it's recorded. The discussion was that overall quite a considerable concern with regards to the further identified sites of interest. What we are moving towards is to relay messages to the public around not picking up any unidentified containers, and reassure that there are decontamination measures in place. Zoonotic surveillance in the area is happening. Following from our earlier discussion, you won't be surprised to hear me here that what I'm interested in is the suggestion that what PHE were moving towards in those early days was to relay message to the public around not picking up any unidentified containers. Your evidence is that, in fact, that public messaging around not picking up unidentified containers wasn't given until after the Amesbury incident, so 3.5 months or more later.
That's correct.
You've told us you didn't see this document. Were you aware in that intervening period that PHE, or anyone else for that matter, was, to use their words, moving towards that messaging, working on it, discussing it, proposing it? Was it something that came on your radar or not?
It wasn't, sir.
Right. Is it something that, perhaps with hindsight, you think that you might have proposed in your role as chair of the SCG? Or is it something that you would have regarded then as being a specialist matter that you would have left to others?
So my role as the SCG chair is to coordinate specialists, and I rely, so for example, the Environment Agency was there. I was reliant upon the Environment Agency to give me information around any environmental risk. Public Health England, I was reliant upon them to undertake that risk assessment and give me the communications as had been agreed on the first day. So yes, could I have actually reflected myself and considered outside of that structure this was potentially a risk and formally asked the question? I guess I could have, but I didn't. I relied upon the specialists who were around the table to advise me.
Is that because it didn't occur to you, or because it occurred to you because you didn't think it was right to raise it?
It didn't occur to me, sir, and just briefly, if it helps, I think I was very much focused on actually almost the backward-facing risk and perhaps didn't, with other partners, considered the forward-facing risk.
And by the backward-facing risk, you mean?
So things such as contact tracing, example, air ambulance had been used, what was the risk to the public, all of those bits were the consequence of actually the response, but actually then, okay, what was the wider potential public health risk that was not on my radar.
Right.
I'm going to move to a different subject where it's not entirely unrelated, and in fact it's another of the issues that we heard from you about in Salisbury. It's the question of training or guidance that may have been, in fact wasn't provided to your own officers in the period between March and July 2018. And for these purposes, if we could go back to your third statement, so 6117 and page 29. And you will recall, Mr. Mills, we spent a bit of time debating the paragraphs on this page of your statement when you gave evidence in Salisbury. You start at paragraph 124 by indicating you've been asked if any internal policies or guidance were distributed within Wiltshire Police advising on the symptoms of nerve agent poisoning and how to respond to them. You explain in paragraph 125 that Wiltshire Police did not proactively provide any advice to officers and staff who may attend subsequent reported future incidents which could be linked to the symptoms of Novichok or a wider poisoning. And then at paragraph 127, you acknowledge in writing, and this is something that you accepted orally in your evidence, that you accept that in light of what had happened in the Scripples poisoning, it would have been sensible to have reminded police officers and staff of their training, associated guidance and role when attending any potential future reported poisoning incidents. And in addition, that it would have been prudent to have provided some high-level specific advice to officers and staff on the signs and symptoms of a potential nerve agent, Novichok poisoning, and how to respond to them.
That's correct, sir.
And I take it, I mean, that was the gist of your evidence, oral evidence in Salisbury, and I take it that remains your position.
Yes, notwithstanding my fourth statement, which I believe we may come to.
Well, and that's what I want to come to. It's just to add one extra aspect to that. Let us go straight to your fourth statement, please. It's INQ 006176. And in the second paragraph, you quote some of that statement that we've just been looking at. So we needn't take time on that. But at paragraph 3, the last line of this page, you say, "It has recently been brought to my attention that on the 13th of March 2018, so 10 days or 9 days after the Scripple poisoning, CTP, Counter-Terrorism Police, helpfully sent Wiltshire Police and other police forces an advice note produced by CTP and the National CBRN Centre relating to hazardous substances in the form of a PowerPoint slide deck for distribution to all frontline officers And that's right, isn't it? They sent you that at that date.
That's correct, sir.
And if we'll come to it in a moment, but let's look at paragraph 4 first. You say you can confirm that this slide deck was circulated to the whole of Wiltshire Police in an internal e-brief on the 27th of March 2018. You say the first item on the e-brief was headed Hazardous Substance Exposure Protocol, stated that all frontline and control room staff asked to please familiarise themselves with this briefing document. We'll see it in a moment, and the underlined words contained a link to the slide deck. The slide deck, you say, does not include the symptoms of nerve agent poisoning, but importantly it reminds and reinforces the remove action card advice and the need to ensure that a methane report is made.
That's correct.
Let's just look at those two documents then. First of all, if we can have a look at the email sent by Wiltshire Police to all officers. That is INQ 006177. If we can just, first of all, look at the very top. We see the date there, that's the 27th of March. So that's nearly 2 weeks after the incoming email from counter-terrorism police.
Yes.
Is that an appropriate delay in forwarding on this sort of information?
I wasn't directly involved in this, but I would have expected that would have gone out sooner than that.
Yes. Well, let's scroll down, please. So can you see just underneath latest news, this is as described in your witness statement. There's a heading, Hazardous Substance Exposure Protocol. I'm sure we're all familiar with this sort of document, as well as a number of other things to which you want to draw your officers' attention. But then the language, this was reproduced in the statement I just wrote, and we see the words in blue, counter-terrorism policing briefing document, underlined, and as you explained in your witness statement, therefore it's a link which people are being invited to follow. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so let's look at what one would find if one clicked on that link. It's the slide deck that you've referred to, and that is INQ 006066. Is this the slide deck?
Yes, it is.
And if we could just go through the slides one by one, please. We see there's a background. We can do this fairly speedily. Who it's intended for, the forms of the substance, hazardous substance, contamination risk. Just pause there. So that advice, if you believe somebody may have been exposed to a hazardous substance, follow the remove action card. That's the first bullet point. The second bullet point, as you mentioned in your witness statement, is to ensure that a methane report is passed to the control room. At this time on a Thursday afternoon, I'm not going to ask you what methane stands for. And the next slide, please. And that's a sort of pictorial representation of that remove advice, isn't it?
Yes.
But importantly, and as you said in your witness statement, although this slide pack informs officers what to do in a hazardous situation, it doesn't offer any guidance about how to spot the signs and symptoms of a nerve agent poisoning.
It doesn't.
And either that or, as we've heard in other evidence, to distinguish what might be a fairly common opiate poisoning from a much more dangerous nerve agent poisoning.
It does not.
None of those sort of details, which we've heard a lot of evidence about by now, are contained in this slide pack.
That's correct, sir.
And so although I'm sure it's well worth reminding people what to do if they find themselves in a hazardous situation, in the particular factual situation of the risk of nerve agent, it doesn't provide your officers with any help in understanding when they are actually in a hazardous situation.
No, it doesn't.
In fact, CTP did circulate a document that did show the signs and symptoms of Novichok nerve poisoning. did they not?
Yes, they did.
And this is a document we looked at briefly last time you gave evidence. If we could have it on screen, please.
Just before you leave that one, could you go back to the first page, please? And scroll up. Or down, rather. That's it. Right. So it refers directly back to Sunday the 4th of March, which is your incident.
That's right, sir.
And this comes from where?
So the National CBRN Centre, sir.
Right. And you've provided a link to it in what is effectively a sort of occasional update to your police officers. Now you're being asked about another document that came from CBRN, as I understand it.
Yes,
All right.
That's correct.
so this is a separate document. If we could have it on screen, please. It's INQ 006069. As I said, you did answer questions about this last time.
We did.
You may not be able to help us with this, but sir, we have heard separate evidence. You may remember Mr. Darch gave evidence about this document as well as Mr. Mills.
Yes.
And he referred to having received it around about the 13th of March. So in fact, roughly at the same time as the slide pack was sent to Wiltshire Police.
Just a few days later. Yep.
Yes, and I won't bring it up, but for your reference, sir, it's paragraph 105.3 of Mr. Darch's statement,
Thank you.
which itself is INQ 006058.
Thank you.
So, roughly the same time, we can see immediately, and this is something we discussed previously, that this document does contain one of those sort of ready reckoners that we've seen in different ways, in different documents, to identify nerve agent poisoning, signs and symptoms that we're familiar with.
That's correct.
But we also see that the red language at the top of the document, that there were handling restrictions imposed on this document, and I think you said that you hadn't seen this, but people who were receiving it at this time were told that they were not permitted, for example, to send it in the same way as we saw the slide pack to all officers in a police force.
Yes, it was limited to CBRN specialists.
Well, is that right?
The handling
Oh,
instructions.
from, I see, CBRN people from ambulance, fire and police. That's how I read it.
Yes.
I follow.
Yes.
So it's tri-service, but it's restricted to people, to CBRN specialists within those services.
So the National CBRN Centre is on behalf of the tri-services, and I think Mr Corner refers to it in his statement. Within the respective emergency services, you have a specialism in CBRN. I mean, I think I referred to it last time at gold, silver, bronze level, sir. And then VN05 is a CBRN tactical commander. It is that community which it is intended to go to, and no further.
And just when you gave evidence before, Mr. Mills, you first of all agreed that there was nothing sensitive about that ready reckoner, about the signs and symptoms. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree.
And you also agreed, and this is really, I think, just what you had previously put in that witness statement that we looked at, that it would have been sensible to have circulated to all of your police staff something along those lines, educating them about what the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning were at around this time.
Yes, I think we should have approached the National CBRN Centre and made a case for actually disseminating that further than they said that we could do.
Yes. Right. All right. Lastly, Mr. Mills, you've, as we've mentioned, kindly given evidence on 3 occasions, and during that process, we have looked at all of the statements you've provided. We've just been looking at the 4th statement. May I ask you, as a matter of form, it's a short statement, because it's been prepared very recently, I'm not even sure that there is a signed copy, but are you content that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am, sir.
So may we adduce that statement?
Yes, 6176.
Yes. But in fact, Mr. Mills's 3 other statements have not been formally adduced. So I wonder if I may, perhaps,
Yes.
so maybe, I think
Read out their numbers.
I will read them out, sir. It's Mr. Mills's first statement, which is INQ 006090. His second statement, INQ 006091. And his third statement, INQ 006117. May we invite you to adduce into evidence those 3 statements?
Yes.
And finally, so we have, during the course of Mr. Mills's evidence today, looked at the witness statement of Inspector Hughes,
Yep.
INQ 006132,
Yes.
and also Mr. Corner,
Superintendent Corner. Yep.
INQ 006163. May we, in addition, adduce those documents?
Yes.
I'm grateful, sir. Those are all my questions for Mr. Mills.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. O'Connor. Are there other questions?
Yes, please. Good afternoon. You know who I am and you know who I represent. I'm not going to spend time on that. I want to just focus on particular areas. The first one is the safety of the public. That's not to ignore police officer or anyone else, the public. You knew quite shortly after the events in Salisbury that you were dealing with a highly dangerous substance called Novichok. So I'm dealing with the point of time in which you knew about that. What was the earliest point, do you think, you knew it was Novichok?
So I believe my statement, sir, says on the evening of the 5th, I was aware that it was
Right.
potentially a nerve agent, and then on the 6th, that was confirmed to me.
Yes. You also knew that an officer, at least one, and we heard from him this morning, who went to the house that Mr. Skripal and his family had occupied, had begun to suffer serious results. You knew that?
I did, sir.
That's Monday or Tuesday, is it?
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
So and you've been asked questions about manning the house. I'm not going back over that, but I am going to deal with the fact that clearly that zone in itself provided a hazard against which the public should be guarded. You accept that?
Sorry, can you just explain zone for me, please, so
Yes.
I can understand the context of that?
Now, you're chair of a particularly important group, are you not, of which we've heard more than once, the Strategic Coordination Group.
That's correct.
And knowing what you did when you would meet with that group, was the issue of public safety something that was discussed by the group and how to deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely, sir. And I've disclosed all of the agendas from those meetings. And
Yes.
I had two standing agenda items. One was the current public health risk to responders, and the second one was the current public health risk general, i.e.
Right.
general public.
General public. Now, the reason for asking that question is, of course, that at the same time as that, you would have known that there was the possibility of what has been described as a secondary incident. Are you aware of that?
Are you asking about the possibility of something having been
Yes.
left behind?
Yes, I'm using that phrase.
Let's make it clear.
Yeah.
I'm aware that searching was going on by counter-terrorism
Yeah.
policing.
Searching would obviously mean they're searching for something related to a highly hazardous substance.
Yes.
Yes. That they'd be searching in public areas. Yes?
Yes, the scenes that we had.
Right. And that being so, the risk of something being found by a member of the public was a real risk, wasn't it?
It was, sir.
And that's what I'm asking in the sense of your meetings that you had. you had specialists sitting round the table, did you not?
Yes, I did.
Right. Do you recall any discussion at all amongst these experts sitting around the table about how the public could be protected and warned about the risks?
So, as I've detailed, we had standing agenda items for that, for public health to advise me, both at a local level and then nationally, around such risks.
What did you do locally about the safety of the public in the weeks after? In other words, the period between Salisbury and Amesbury.
So immediately was locking down all the scenes. So we need
Yes.
to understand the movements of the Scripples and lock down those 11 or so scenes. Once we'd done that, obviously we've spoken about guarding of those scenes. And then the stack needed to consider a whole number of different things in relation to what I think I framed last time, who touched what, when, where, and what the risk was to them. And we worked through that both locally and nationally to try and understand that risk.
Were there any warnings put out to the public by you?
So, as I've touched on day one in the Strategic Coordination Group number 3, it was agreed that Public Health England nationally would consider the risk and
Yes.
advise us on the communications. And then the role locally was to make sure that was communicated to the public in addition to whatever was happening nationally.
And I asked the question, what did you in the end do locally about warning the public?
So we, further to the receipt of the agreed messaging from Public Health England nationally, I put in place on day one a media cell, which was a partnership media cell, which is standard when you set up a strategic coordination group, and they repeated on a number of occasions through social media, media releases, public meetings, the advice which had been received from Public Health England.
Now, did that advice include, don't pick up, how to recognise something that may contain it?
Well,
and so on?
we've
Yes,
Anthony, it's not that it's a bad point, but we've had it.
Yes. I'm not going to spend much more time on it. Do you recall the kind of specific information that might have prevented somebody picking up an item containing Novichok?
So from incident number 2, yes, absolutely, that was put in place within a couple of days. Incident number 1, no, from my role, no such messaging was put out.
Right, that's why I'm asking the questions, and I'm going to, as it were, curtail this part of it by asking if you could see a document. It wasn't addressed to you, I make it very clear straight away, but it concerns Public Health England, and they were sitting around the table. The number 004704 0001. And I just want to ask if you've ever seen this before. There's an email attached to Salisbury nerve agent attack, risk of secondary incident. So the email should be coming up there. It's dated, of some relevance here, it's the 15th of March, which is a day after some of the incidents you've talked about so far, events you've talked about. And you will see that it's an email indicating that somebody has made a stab, you'll see that, at the a reasonable worst case scenario is the initials there for a secondary nerve agent incident. And it might be useful to get PHE and NHS England to consider some of the key questions. Now, first of all, have you seen this email before?
I saw it last time that I
Yeah.
gave evidence.
And the question is, therefore, the framework that goes with this, which you've seen before, in other words, the nerve agent attack, risk of secondary, and then there's a whole series of situations and actions. Now, were those situations and actions, which include the public, and as well as first responders, when you were sitting around the table or anywhere else, were those actions actioned by you locally?
They were not communicated to the local level, sir.
They weren't. it would have been advantageous had they been.
I agree.
You agree? Now, I want to turn to one or two other topics. And I'm going to summarize, if I may. I'm asking you these questions because between your last appearance and now, an officer who might have been asked some of them has not been able to appear. I'm going to put it shortly. These are to do with the officer called Laws. I think you'll agree from your previous evidence that what should have happened here is that the hospital dealing with Dawn Sturgess should have had accurate information about Dawn Sturgess contained by the police. That didn't happen, and it should have happened, and namely accurate information.
No, Mr. Mansfield, I'm sorry, that won't do. It's 3 or 4 questions, all wrapped up
Yes,
in one.
I'm sorry.
And they're very general, and the answers may well be different to different bits of it.
Well,
So
they may.
could you please be very specific?
Yes, certainly. Do you, I'm trying to save time.
I know you are, but you're not achieving it. Now, come on.
Do you agree that the Wiltshire police had no intelligence suggesting Dawn Sturgess herself was an addict, was an illicit drug user, or anything of that kind?
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, again, we've had all this, Mr.
Yes, but I'm sorry, it's one global question.
Right.
The global question is that hospital were not given accurate information, and they should have been.
So the hospital was given information in relation to Mr. Rowley being a drug dealer, and I believe that's as far as it went at that point in time, around relevant recent information intelligence concerning him, not Miss Sturgess.
Right. And it would have been preferable, plainly, for the hospital to have been apprised of accurate information.
So I think I'd almost go back to Jessup here, sir, and the information intelligence element and ensuring that all relevant information was given to the hospital.
Yes.
I would agree, because that
I'm going
helps.
to come back to it in a moment in relation to some other questions. Just on the question of Dawn Sturgess, the officer called Laws went round, I don't know whether you know anything about this, went round to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Sturgess in order to give them some information. It appeared that, in fact, they already knew about Novichok, and the officer was duly shocked. Do you agree that she should have been briefed about that approach to the family so that, in fact, she might have known in advance about their position?
Yes, I agree.
You agree? Thank you. Then I... Just one moment, because there's some other questions I would seek to ask. So yes, may I address you on some other questions which affect what your evidence today? Mm-hmm. So the questions I would like to ask, if I may, is, since the officer has said very clearly that central to what was happening in Salisbury was the question of the information relating to the Scripples. He said that's central, that all they had was open source material.
Yes.
And that there were certain things that obviously depended on having accurate information. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
That's correct. Now, the question I would like to ask is, had you been given accurate information about, for example, Special Branch ringing back or somebody in London ringing you to inform you, yes, the Scripples are there before the day itself? In other words, you've been informed from the moment the Scripples entered Salisbury, which is, of course, some years before. From what you're saying, you didn't know that, did you?
We did not know that.
Right. So I'm going very carefully because I appreciate there are areas here, and I'll do it very carefully indeed. So you didn't know. The question I have is, first stage, at this stage before Salisbury happens, Were there actions or precautionary measures or warning flags or whatever that you could have taken, considered and taken prior to the Salisbury event?
If he'd known,
If he'd known.
if he'd known that he'd got the scribbles on his
Yes.
patch, is that basically
That's it.
Well, I understand the question, Mr. Mansfield, and it's one I think which I'm going to have to address. But the difficulty with this witness doing it today is that you can't answer the question without going into considerable detail about what might have been known. And that is a topic which will have to be addressed in closed.
I appreciate
You
the
may
point.
rest assured that it is going to be dealt with, but it's not for this witness today. So no.
May I adapt it slightly?
Well, you can try.
Which doesn't I don't think it transgresses. In other words, the first part of the question is, were there, putting it vernacularly...
It's still far too... I'm afraid you can't answer the question. I've thought about this for some time, Mr. Mansfield.
Yes.
The question can't be answered without us knowing, as it were, everything that there is to know. And everything that there is to know will only come out, can only be investigated under different regime.
Well, so I think you understand the predicament.
No, I understand that you are raising a question which it's important that I should address, and you may rest assured that I shall. What you can't do is, under the guise of asking questions, which actually are more statements than questions, if I may say so, but under the guise of asking questions, what you can't do is, as it were, attempt to shortcut that procedure. Can't be done.
May I make it clear what the question would have been, which is...
You have.
That's all. It's not a statement, it's were there measures you could
Yes,
have...
no, you've said that. I understand.
That's the question.
I understand that, but the answer
All right. May I make it clear, I'm sorry to develop this, but it's an area of importance I think the officer will appreciate. That's before it happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next stage would be, when it did happen in Salisbury, well, perhaps I can put this question. Would it have helped to have known about the background of the Scripples, at that point?
That was all of the activity, the 4 telephone calls on that evening that were undertaken with the South West Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit to try and establish further information.
The answer is yes.
Well, yes.
Well, that's what you were trying to get, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I take it that I can't ask the further question.
No, you can't. Not
I
if
think
it's like
it's
the last one, Mr. Mansfield. You can't.
Yes, I'm not going to put it again in a different guise
I'm afraid not.
for this, but it is 2-stage. I make it because the
No,
considerations...
I've got it. You want
Right.
me to investigate it at both stages?
Yes, please.
Will be done.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. No, it's helpful, Mr. Mansfield. Anybody else? No. Yes, Mr. O'Connor.
So that concludes our business for today.
Right. Now, is Mr. Mills finished now, or is he coming back again?
Unless anything unexpected happens, this concludes his evidence.
Probably finished, Mr. Mills, but you'd better keep a watching eye on us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. All right. In that event, Mr. Connor, that completes the business for today, does it?
It does so, yes.
Then Monday, please, at 10 o'clock. Under which regime?
I think it will be level 1.
It'll be level 1 to start with, won't it?
Yes.
Monday's the 11th. We shall observe a minute's silence at the appropriate time. Right. Thank you very much indeed.